The number on the adjuster's clipboard was 40% loss. Gene Hassler stood at the edge of the gravel road and read it over the man's shoulder before he'd finished writing. He didn't say anything. He was already running the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not good. 40% loss on 40 acres of first-cut alfalfa in July of 1986, with feed prices where they were, translated to a feed gap he could not fill cheaply. Not a catastrophic number, a slow bleed number, the kind that doesn't end an operation in a week but makes every decision for the next 8 months harder than it needs to be. He signed the initial paperwork. The adjuster left. Gene stood at the field edge for a few minutes. Then he walked in. I want to say something about insurance assessments before we get into what Gene actually found. A crop insurance adjuster doing a field survey is not doing what the farmer does when he walks his own ground. The adjuster is working from a protocol, a grid pattern, documented methodology, moisture tables that have to be reproducible across a large claims portfolio. That protocol is designed to produce a fair average across 40 acres. It is not designed to capture the internal variation of a specific field after a specific storm. I filed 2 crop insurance claims during the farm crisis years. Both times the assessment was professionally done and approximately correct for the field as a whole. Both times the number was written across the entire acreage as though the damage were uniform. Neither field was uniform. What the adjuster's number tells you is the average. What the average conceals is the distribution. And when you're standing in a field with 2 days of dry weather and a mold clock running, the distribution is the only thing that matters. Gene's field had a distribution. He was about to find out what it was. The storm had come through Wednesday night. No tornado, no flooding, just sustained wind at 40 to 45 miles per hour and a hard lateral rain that lasted 3 hours. The alfalfa had been cut the previous Friday, 5 days on the windrow close to baling moisture. Another day, maybe 2, and Gene would have been done. Instead, the storm hit the cut hay broadside. Alfalfa that has been cut has no root system to anchor it. It's loose material lying on the soil surface, and when a hard lateral rain hits it, it goes down and stays down. The windrows didn't scatter. They compressed, matted flat into the soil, wet on both sides, pressed under wind pressure and rain weight simultaneously. When Gene walked the field at first light Thursday, the rows looked like something had ironed them into the ground. That's the problem with cut hay in a storm. Mold wasn't a question of if. It was a question of how fast and how deep into the windrow it would reach before the surface dried enough to tell. The adjuster had arrived Friday morning, walked a grid, noted the visible matting, checked his moisture tables, assessed 40% loss. He wasn't wrong exactly. He was looking at 40 acres from above and finding the average. Gene spent 20 minutes after the truck left at the field edge. Then he walked in and looked for what the average was hiding. The field had a grade, east to west, slight enough to miss from the road, significant enough that water moved. The storm had come from the northwest. Those 2 facts meant the damage wasn't uniform. He walked the eastern third first. Those windrows were flat, dark at the base. He crouched and pulled the mat apart with both hands. The bottom inch came up grey-brown and wet. Direct soil contact, moisture locked in, cellular structure starting to break down. He pressed a handful. Water came out slowly. Not dairy grade, not beef grade. Bedding at best, if it dried at all before going to mold. He stood and marked his notebook. Eastern third, roughly 15 acres. Right off. He moved to the center band, 20 acres across the mid-slope. The windrows here had compressed but not fully flattened. Some loft remained in the middle of each row. A pocket of airspace between the top layer and the mat below. He worked his hand into one windrow from the side and felt the separation, wet on the bottom 6 inches, cooler in the middle, top surface dry enough to crumble slightly at the edge. That separation was the information he needed. The western section, 5 acres on the upper grade, showed the least damage. Bottom was damp, not wet. Middle layers had held structure. He looked at the sky. Clear. The forecast said 2 dry days before humidity came back from the south. He wrote 40% uniform on paper, eastern 15 equals loss, center 20 equals question, west 5 equals possible. Clock, 48 hours. The question was mechanical. What could he get off the ground in 2 days without making the damage worse? Gene's primary rake was a rotary unit from 1981. High-profile frame, tine clearance several inches off the ground, designed for speed on standing windrows. That clearance was the problem. A matted windrow pressed into soil is not a standing windrow. The rotary rake would ride above the compressed mat, turning only the top surface material, leaving the wet base untouched. He'd lose the separation he needed to sort by grade and introduce debris into the better material at the same time. He needed something that ran lower. Gene had bought a ground-driven wheel rake at an estate auction in 1974. A 1960s unit, steel wheel teeth, low-clearance frame, no hydraulic lift. He'd paid $60 for it because it came with a second piece of equipment he actually wanted, and he'd kept it because keeping costs almost nothing and 2 uses in 12 years had already justified the storage space. Once for raking flooded hay off saturated ground, once for collecting a windrow that had been scattered by equipment running through the field at the wrong time. This was a third situation. The wheel rake's low frame could engage a compressed mat from the side rather than from above. Running at low throttle and a shallow angle across the windrow, the wheel teeth could catch the upper layers of the mat and roll them off the contaminated base, creating a separate row of material that had not been in sustained soil contact. He wasn't trying to recover the whole field. He was trying to separate what was recoverable from what wasn't before the mold in the base layer migrated upward. He hitched the wheel rake to his older tractor and ran the first pass on the center section at low speed, cutting across the windrow at a shallow angle. The wheel teeth dragged low through the mat from the side, and the upper 4 to 6 inches peeled up and over into a separate narrow row. The bottom layer, grey, compressed, soil-heavy, stayed largely in place. He stopped after the first 2 rows, got out and looked at what he had. Not clean hay, soil at the edges, some clumping, uneven moisture across the row. But not the mat. Better than the mat was the only standard that mattered right now. He ran the thumb and forefinger test. Pull a small bunch, twist it once firmly, read what you feel. Breaks dry, close to bailing moisture. Bends without breaking, still too wet. Beads or releases water, problem. The material from that first pass bent without breaking, not ready. Possibly gettable in 24 hours if the sky held. He kept moving. By the second afternoon, the top layer rows from the center section had dried enough to test seriously. He pulled material from 5 points and ran the twist test on each. 3 came back dry or near dry. 2 still bent without breaking. He made a decision. 1 more hour, then bail regardless. The humidity forecast had shifted. Southern moisture was coming back earlier than the weekend prediction. He could feel the air changing. His grading system ran on twine color. Green on the corner of a bale, dairy grade or close to it. Orange, monitor, probable beef grade, check core temperature in 48 hours. Plain Cecil, beef forage, no further sorting needed. The baler ran until 10:30 that night. The first bales off the top layer section came in heavy, slightly over the dry hay norm, meaning moisture was still present. He stacked them separately, marked the cleanest rows green, the heavier ones orange. Then he went inside. He told himself the orange bales needed 24 hours before he cracked one. He was right about the timeline. He did not sleep particularly well. He was back at the barn at 6 the next morning. The stack looked the same from the outside, which told him nothing. The outside of a hay bale is always the same. What matters is 12 inches in. He picked a bale from the middle tier of the orange section, set it on the barn floor, and worked the hay hook into the twine. The bale split open along the compression lines. He pushed both hands into the core, palms flat, the way you check if bread has risen all the way through. Hot. Not warm. Not the acceptable warmth of a fresh bale still releasing field heat. Hot in the way that has a different quality to it. A slightly sour edge underneath the normal hay smell, the kind of heat that comes from biological activity rather than from ambient temperature. He stood there with his hands in the bale for a moment. Fermentation in a hay bale follows a predictable sequence. Moisture content above 20% activates bacteria and fungi that begin breaking down plant material. The process generates heat. In the first stage, the heat is modest and the process is largely reversible if the bale dries. In the second stage, the temperature climbs into the range where mold colonies establish and protein degrades. In the third stage, which most hay people call the danger zone, above 150 degrees Fahrenheit, spontaneous combustion becomes a real risk and the feed value is largely destroyed. Gene was not near stage 3, but he was not in stage 1 either. He pulled his hands out and checked the two bales on either side of the first one, both hot at the core. Not identical temperatures, the one on the left was slightly cooler, the one on the right slightly warmer. That variation told him the moisture content hadn't been uniform across the row when he baled. Some bales had gone in at better moisture than others. The warmer ones were the ones that had been too wet. He counted the orange twine bales in that tier. 23. He walked to the far end of the stack and checked a bale there. Also hot. He checked one from the lower tier. Less hot, noticeably cooler than the upper ones. Heat rises and concentrates in stacked hay. The lower tier being cooler was expected. The upper tier being this warm was not. He stood in the barn for a while and thought about what he was looking at. The salvage operation had taken 2 days of labor, tractor fuel, and the cost of running his secondary baler instead of his primary. The feed value he'd recovered, if the bales held, was roughly $1,100 to $1,400 against the cost of buying replacement forage at market. That was the number he'd been working toward. That was the number that made the difference between a manageable fall and a difficult one. If the orange twine stack went to mold, that number went with it. He had not considered, when he was running the wheel rake and making the decision to bale, despite the elevated moisture, that the salvage could erase itself in the barn. The risk had been there. He had accepted it implicitly when he decided not to wait for lower moisture. Now the risk was visible and had a temperature. He went back to the house and pulled out the Extension Service publication he kept in the filing cabinet. The one on hay storage and fire prevention that he'd gotten at a county meeting in 1983 and never thrown away. He read the temperature guidelines again. Acceptable range for fresh bales in the first week. Up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit with normal biological activity. Concerning range, 130 to 150. Intervention required above 150. The publication recommended checking core temperature with a thermometer probe rather than by hand if you suspected elevated heating. He did not own a thermometer probe. He drove to the farm supply in town and bought one. He was back in the barn within the hour. He probed 7 bales from the orange twine section systematically, 2 from the upper tier, 2 from the middle, 3 from the lower, and wrote the numbers in his notebook. Upper tier, 128 degrees, 131 degrees. Middle tier, 119 degrees, 122 degrees. Lower tier, 112 degrees, 108 degrees, 111 degrees. The upper tier was in the concerning range. Not the intervention range, but close enough that any upward movement would push it there. He checked the green twine section next. Those bales had gone in at better moisture. Upper tier probe, 109 degrees. Middle, 103 degrees. Normal, no issue there. The question was whether the orange twine upper tier was still climbing or had peaked. Hay bale temperature typically peaks within 48 to 72 hours of baling and then declines if moisture is in the acceptable range. If the moisture had been too high, the temperature continued to climb past the peak and didn't plateau. Gene had baled the orange twine section approximately 30 hours ago. He was either near the peak or still ascending, and the only way to tell the difference was to check again in 12 hours. He checked at 6 that evening. Upper tier, 129 degrees, 132 degrees, 1 degree higher in the first bale, 1 degree higher in the second. Not a significant increase, but not a decrease. He checked again at 11 p.m. before he went to bed. Upper tier, 127 degrees, 130 degrees, 2 degrees lower than the evening reading. He wrote those numbers in the notebook and did not write anything next to them. He went inside and slept better than the night before, though not well. At 5:30 the next morning, he was back in the barn. He didn't go directly to the probe. He walked the full stack first, the way he'd been doing every check, looking for visual signs, any discoloration on the outside of bales, any change in the smell of the barn. Nothing visible. The smell was hay with a slight fermentation note, not sharp, not the acrid edge that precedes serious mold. He picked up the probe. Upper tier, 121 degrees. 118 degrees. He stood there for a moment with the probe in his hand. The temperature had dropped 9 degrees since the previous evening, 13 degrees since the peak. The biological activity in those bales was subsiding, not escalating. The moisture, while elevated, had been within the range where the process eventually self-limits. The bacteria and fungi consuming available substrate. The heat output declining as that substrate was exhausted. The stack was safe, not perfect. The protein in those bales had taken a hit from the fermentation activity. He'd lose 1 to 2 percentage points of crude protein compared to what the hay would have been in a clean harvest. The bales would not grade as high as the green twine section. He'd already planned to sell them separately and would price them accordingly. But they were not mold. They were not a loss. He wrote the morning temperature readings in the notebook. Then he put his palm flat against the side of an upper-tier bale. Not the probe this time, just his hand, and held it there for a few seconds. Warm, not hot. That was enough. When Gene sat down with his ledger a week after the storm, the accounting looked like this. Insurance payout, 40% loss on 40 acres at assessed yield and current rate. Fixed. Would not change. Salvage, center section top layer cuts, green twine bales. Approximately 41 bales at dairy grade or close to it. One delivery to a dairy operation in October at the top of the local market. Salvage, center section top layer cuts, orange twine bales, approximately 23 bales. Graded beef forage after the core temperature event. Sold at the beef forage rate, not misrepresented as anything else. Salvage, secondary lower grade rows, 41 bales, plain twine, beef forage. Eastern 15 acres, left on the ground for incorporation. Insurance had priced that section. Nothing further. The orange twine bales had nearly erased themselves. If the temperature had continued to climb instead of peaking and declining. If the moisture had been 2 or 3 percentage points higher when he baled. If the humidity had moved back in faster than it did. If he hadn't checked at 11 p.m. and again at 5:30. The upper tier would have crossed into the intervention range and he would have had to break those bales apart to prevent further damage. The labor cost of that operation, combined with the likely mold loss in the core material, would have reduced the salvage return significantly. The margin between the outcome he got and the outcome he'd been worried about, measured in core temperature, was 9 degrees. He hadn't controlled the temperature, he'd watched it. Watching it and knowing the numbers that mattered, and having a probe that could produce an actual measurement rather than a palm estimate, those were the things that let him know when the temperature had peaked and when it had cleared. The final salvage value, accounting for the reduced price on the orange twine bales, came to approximately $1,200 in avoided feed purchases against the fall and winter feeding period. Combined with the insurance payout, that number closed the gap the storm had opened. Not comfortably, within workable range. The insurance payout had priced the damage that was visible on Friday morning. The salvage operation had recovered what the average had concealed. The core temperature monitoring had prevented the recovery from undoing itself in the barn. 3 separate decisions, each one necessary, none of them sufficient alone. The wheel rake went back on its wall hooks. Gene greased the fittings and wrote a tag for the hitch bar. The date, the field, the specific condition it had been used for, what it had been able to do, that the rotary rake couldn't. He hung the tag on the hook. The thermometer probe went into the cabinet above the workbench, next to the moisture meter. On the morning after the final temperature check, before he started the day's work, Gene walked through the barn one more time. He stopped at the orange twine stack and pressed his palm against the side of a bale in the upper tier. Warm. Just warm. He left his hand there for a moment, feeling for the heat differential that had been there 3 days ago and wasn't there now. Then he took his hand back, picked up the probe, recorded the final reading in the notebook. 103 degrees, normal, and closed the cover. The stack had held. Insurance payout, assessed 40% loss on 40 acres. Salvage value recovered, approximately $1,200 in avoided feed purchases. Risk that nearly erased the gain, 9 degrees of core temperature, measured at 11 p.m. on the second night. Those three numbers are the whole story. What does it cost to salvage a damaged hay crop? The honest answer is, it depends on whether the bales hold. Jean found that out at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, standing in a barn with a thermometer probe and a stack of orange twine bales that were either going to stay at 131 degrees or weren't. They didn't. The stack held. The numbers worked out. If you want to understand how farm operations absorbed damage in the 1980s, the grading decisions, the monitoring, the math that ran in the background of every season, subscribe. These are the stories that rarely got written down.